visual analysis and look at a practice example of it in a second. So what to know about section C and how it looks on the year 12 exam. It's 2 pages of material. Definitely some visuals, expect at least 1 to 2 images, of course, but not necessarily just one piece. So how you are doing your SACs in school and preparing for comparative tasks, you need to be prepared for a comparative task on your exam as well, because in recent years it's never been a comparative. However, they never exclude the possibility that it could be. Also, you're going to have a different year 12 study design next year, and I feel that they've added more comparative aspects to your analyzing argument in this year's new study design, so it's quite likely they might even change it back to a comparative task like it used to be a couple study designs ago. I feel they may bring that back. So just be aware, prepare for comparative, structure your comparative argument analyses really well. So the task is essentially a test of selectivity, being super selective, only choosing the most relevant evidence and PLTs. You're not going to write about every little thing you find in every little piece of evidence. You need to really plan and select the best evidence to analyze. Um, and analyzing language is important, and do it a few times, but so is the structure and flow of your essay. So it's often the quickest task to write just because it's so formulaic and all the same. It's also really therefore possible to get very good at this section and get really high marks here. And you can do that for year 12. That should be your aim. If you struggle with English overall, definitely analyzing argument is a great section to focus because of how formulaic it is. You need to show your workings and explain your analysis. Don't skip any of the steps like intended effect, explaining the effect of the language or how it contributes to the argument. Assessors will not fill in the gaps for you. They will literally read a sentence where you've moved on, you've just described the PLT, and they'll say, why has the student included this? When we look at contentions, they need to include quite a bit of information, so it's helpful to develop a formula. Generally, your contentions should identify what the issue is, identify the tone of the offer, whether the writer sees the issue as good or bad, either implying that they see it as good or bad or using a specific word for if it's good or bad. So kind of a bit more leniency here. When talking about the issue in pink, if you show just in there that the offer standpoint and you imply it, you don't have to mention it again. The justification for the writer's view. So this needs to be the main reason why they feel or think that way from the overall piece. And then the solution that they propose, what they want to be done. So if you do want a template, you can see this one here. The author, say, critically contends that the issue is word for good or bad because the main reason for that view, and therefore proposes blah, blah, blah. Let's look at an example of how we can write a contention going through the whole process. A lot of us are feeling alone this season, even though the loneliness was supposed to end last spring. That variant after variant after variant insists on barging in to interrupt our return to normal, engenders a sense of defeat and exhaustion. About a year ago, pandemic burnout entered our vocabularies, and now we've stumbled upon the consummate burnout game. Togetherness in solitude is what we've been after throughout this crisis. What we're looking for in our video calls or group chats or remote cookbook clubs and our viral debates over the latest miniseries or movie we watched, not because it looked good, but because everyone else was watching. Wordle allows us to win a bit of that togetherness every day, which hopefully brings our lonely hearts a little bit of peace. And we see how this is clearly an advertisement for Wordle, even though it's really drawing on emotional appeals. So our stuff we need for our contention, we're going to say, what is the issue, the subject at hand? Clearly pandemic loneliness and isolation. The author is suggesting it's bad because it's isolating people. Why? It has been long lasting and seemingly never ending. And the author's goal is to bring us together through Wordle. This is the solution that they propose. So here's how we write a contention. being mindful that you should also put a tone in there, but because it's such a short piece, it's um, not particularly relevant. You know, your argument analysis are going to be a lot more, um, a lot more, have a lot more text and more clear overall tone that you can find. Maybe we could say she, um, you know, the tone is quite emotional. Um, I wouldn't even say that. I wouldn't even say that this one has a too consistent tone. So disregard that, but be mindful. We should have a tone word in our contentions because we just covered that as well. So obviously our contention should state what is the issue, does the author think the issue is good or bad, use relevant vocabulary, suggest the implications, so the main reasons why it's bad, and what is the goal of the author. So here we have Molly Roberts contends that pandemic loneliness, which is our issue, is taking its toll on the populace. So this is the main reason why it's bad, the implications. As she suggests, that it can be positively curbed by the sense of togetherness which activities such as Wordle foster. So that is their goal, to promote Wordle. So we've clearly identified that it was bad and described it, and the idea that it's taking its toll is our main reason for the issue being bad. We've identified the issue as well, and we've stated the goal. The only other thing we want is a tone, but for a short piece like that, it's normal enough to see a distinct tone or voice for the piece. But ultimately, your task is to analyze, and this is what Vika wants you to do, how the language, both visual and written, is used, and how these specific authorial choices shape meaning and argument so as to position the audience in a particular way for a particular reason. So you can really see that if you do the what, how, why process, you tick all of these boxes that are, you know, in your little text box on the exam. How, the language, and authorial choices are what way is the audience positioned, our how, and the reason how it contributes to the contention is our why. So how do we structure an analyzing argument essay? Our introduction must include our context, our contention, our tone, usually combined in one sentence, audience, and our purpose. As part of including the context information, we will also include the title of the piece, the place and date of publication, the author's name, where it appeared, the text type. I think I repeated a couple of those, but you get the idea. Hopefully you remember that you have to do that. So you'll obviously start with a sentence, you know, usually introducing the issue, and then you'll jump into, you know, author's name, discusses the issue and blah 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 in her opinion piece, title, published in, place of publication, on, date. That's all you need to do. Then you jump into your contention in a adjective tone. The author contends that, and then we lead into, we can put our audience as part of our contention, but it's best if you have a separate audience sentence elaborating on the audience just a little bit further to show you have a complex understanding. And we don't want our audience to be vague and very general. We don't want to say it's the general public. We don't want to say it's Australians, you know. Hopefully you can find something more specific. Progressive audiences, millennials, we might have um, a particular age group. So those kinds of ideas, and those are pretty common ones. So body paragraphs, idea based. Our body paragraphs are our arguments in our piece. And don't forget authorial intent and the reader. So, for example, looking at this one, it is Day's very suggestion of the power of ink that she urges readers of Strigbeat to observe the significance of tattoos, namely for their symbols of pain and suffering. And showing how we tick everything off and go through the whole process. But we've talked about what, how, why so much. And then we want a final sentence, our linking sentence, to link back to the ultimate authorial intent or the effect on the reader. Here is that possible introduction formula. You can follow this for an introduction that's going to include everything. So starting with background information, this is our context, it's introducing the issue. Then we cite from the text the date, publisher, text type, and author. Then we state the tone and the contention. Then we go into the purpose and the specific target audience. Purpose is like, what is it trying to do? So what solution is the author proposing? Why are they writing this piece to begin with? So we saw from that contention formula that we can link that into our contention as the solution proposed. So for finding the audience and making it very specific, which it has to be, ask yourself two things. Who has a vested interest in this issue? And you might get some ideas from the potentially from the publication details. Say, is there some kind of is it coming from a school newsletter? Well, what are the people that could be concerned by the issue? Maybe the parents of the school that read the newsletter. Also consider who are the people of influence, and if relevant in your introduction, mention any comparative material. Similarly to how you've introduced your main article, you will have to mention your comparative material. There are different structures though. Some students have like kind of like a second introduction after they discuss the first article that introduces and acts as a second introduction to the comparative material, but it's really good to just combine all of this information in one introduction, and it's more concise as well. So if there's another article, bring it in, state how the again, you will have to cite the text, so it will have a different date, publisher, text type, author. Then state how the tone is different and what the different contention is. Even if it's very similar, there should be nuances in meaning where you can find some differences, and you should state what it aims to do, the purpose. The audience may be the same, and you may not have to mention it again. If it's different, address that as well. And if it's a stand-alone visual, a piece on its own by another artist, so it's not embedded within the text, that's also your comparative material, so you can mention it. If it's embedded within the comparative article, you don't have to mention the visual separately, that you can do in a body paragraph. So we want 2 body paragraphs on the biggest article. If we have embedded images, the links to the images must be in bigger paragraphs. We will never discuss the image in its own paragraph. We will instead determine which argument does the image contribute to. So it should look like this, having a topic sentence or argument, evidence from the text, and explanation of the quote, linking into the why analysis of our textual evidence, going through the what, how, why. Then we connect the evidence with the image, and then we do the what, how, why process for the image in relation to the argument. Then we connect it back to the argument and the ultimate intended effect. And we want 1 body paragraph as a comparison because we have comparative material. So for each discussion of the second article, the smaller one, we will try and make a small link to the main article. How does the first author argue something about the idea, and what is the intended effect on the audience compared to the other author and what they have argued? So make little comparative links, but doesn't have to be everywhere, just every once in a while, to make sure we hit that comparative aspect of the task. And also discussing what is different in terms of the authorial intent or argument of the author or intended effect on the reader. Then we want 1 mini body paragraph that looks at the final arguments of both pieces. For example, upon conclusion of The Power of Ink, Day returns to the discrepancy between modern and traditional tattooing and their symbolism. As they scornfully lament the shift of tattoos from reckless to try-hard, social beat readers are conclusively positioned to condemn the commodification of tattoos. Undifferentiated from any cosmetic quirk, Day prompts readers to criticize tattoos as an ordinary ornament and share in their regret at their diminished uniqueness. And here we have one comparative aspect is here, as they scornfully laments the shift of statues from reckless to try hard. And then we have this idea of social beat, and we've summarized the main arguments or contention of this piece. And if this is a comparative task, we can bring in and do this for the other comparative material as well. Now, don't worry if you find this structure throws you off, because there are a lot of structures you can follow for an argument analysis. If you're comfortable using what your teacher has proposed that you use and you think it really works and it's a good example to use, you can stick by that. This is more for a structure that would work and a structure that you can follow that will be very effective if you do need that help and advice. So we want to also look for subtle persuasive language techniques. These can help us get higher marks because they're important things to identify and often not identified by a lot of students. So connotations, does the language have negative or positive connotations? Making sure we quote the words that show that, and being more specific than that. If it's negative, how so? If it's positive, how so? What's an adjective we can use to describe that? And we have some other examples here. We can even talk about things like prolepsis, framing the argument, sentence structure, high and low modality verbs, which now you have a really good understanding of high and low modality verbs because we've run through that in the exam criteria section. Parallels and associations, juxtapositions, and tonal shifts. Tonal shifts, very important. I would even say, because there are few of them, this is something you should identify every single time it comes up and quote to prove. Making sure that you're right about the fact that it's a tonal shift and it's not just a couple of sentences um in a positive tone and then it goes back to being whatever it was, say tonal. Not all, you want a tonal shift, you want the tone to clearly shift and to be maintained for a while to be able to say with certainty that it was a tonal shift. Juxtapositions are when things are put side by side that are very distinct or different or potentially opposites. That's a juxtaposition. And you can think about what effect that may create. So, guys, we're going to jump back into visual analysis and talk about how we can analyze visual material looking at an example. Remembering, this has to go in a body paragraph where there's some sort of argument and the visuals should be contributing to that argument, unless it is comparative material and it is different and it is a standalone image. And we will describe what the visual is literally depicting, talking about its foreground, background, what we see overall. Then we're going to bring in the symbolic meaning that it has and discuss how it adds to or detracts from the writer's argument. So what we need to analyze in a visual, here are some ideas. Symbolism, very common. Visuals often act as symbols. Any labels, any juxtaposition, opposing things put side by side, the size or the scale of objects, facial expressions, speech and speech bubbles, any background information, a caricature, which are a specific type of visuals that act as a political commentary of sorts. They've originated from the period of the Cold War between Russia and the USA, where caricatures were used as political commentaries and oftentimes as propaganda to depict the other country in a super unfavorable way, and say insulting things about their society and their life. But we still use them to this day for oftentimes for some sort of comedic, ironic effect, and they do tend to include symbolism if you are interested in that text type, because this is a great meta language term. You see a lot of caricatures in argument analysis, so I do urge you to get familiar with caricatures and what they portray, and links between the visual and the written text. So looking at an example of a cartoon, this is from the 2015 VCA exam. A good way to consider the symbolic meaning of the visual is to remember the conventions of different visuals, like how I've just gone through the conventions of, and even the context surrounding caricatures with you guys. Cartoons, we know cartoons are pencil drawings, and they tend to have text on them, and they tend to have both a foreground and a background. In most cases, they tend to have both foreground and background elements. So we already know about the kinds of things we want to discuss. Let's have a look at this example, how we've discussed this specific image. The community garden movement is no passing fashion. During the Second World War, everyone in Britain was urged to dig for victory by growing vegetables in every bit of spare land. So you can see how we've really fluently linked in the cartoon as part of our argument, whatever we were discussing before. We're talking about the garden movement is growing, and it has been during all of history. And now we brought in this context of the Second World War, which is the context and the period of this image when it was produced. And we introduced the image by really fluently just quoting the slogan, dig for victory, that's present at the top of the image. By growing vegetables in every bit of spare land. Now we've defined the context of the image. The shovel with the foot is showing that we're trying to dig the ground to plant more seeds and grow agriculture everywhere. Backwards and nature strips were dug up in the struggle to keep families fed. In the crisis of war, people suddenly understood how vulnerable a society is if we have forgotten or never learned how to produce our own food. And then we might go to discuss the image further. But what do we see that really is key here and is relating to the image a little bit? Struggle to keep families fed. We see in the background these families. So this idea that we want to talk about the struggle to keep families fed, if we want to write a really good analysis of the visual, we're going to include that in the background we see faces of the family members and children, indicating that there's that struggle to keep the families fed, and that these children are also vulnerable because this is done for their sake. The imagery combined with the text, their sake, indicates that they're vulnerable and they need to be taken care of. So what do we have? We have an appeal to family values. And then we can talk about this symbolic shoe with the shovel in the foreground and how that's indicating that that shovel and that over harvesting of and overgrowing of land is making these populations more vulnerable because of that struggle to keep them fed as the land has been damaged. So it's a sense of, impending doom. It kind of intends the intended effect on readers is to encourage them to protest this, be part of the garden movement, and therefore help keep their families fed. So what do we see overall? What are the things we can analyze for this image? And a lot of these are things that I've said. Patriotism, dig for victory for their sake, and family, that it revolves around patriotism. Children are present, so family values, appeal to family values. The boot on the shovel also signifies strength and hard work. For their sake, vulnerability of children, and their reliance on others' contribution and hard work. So we can interpret that shovel with the shoe from two different perspectives. We can talk about the boot on the shovel signifying strength and hard work because this slogan does have a different argument. This is prior to the garden movement where it's saying grow your own vegetables. We can talk about that strength and hard work, or we can interpret it through a different lens in terms of we could say that the shovel is the agriculture industry, and it's pushing all those families behind and it's disregarding them and it's over harvesting and overplanting the land and ruining how fertile it is and impairing on our ability to take care of our children and our families. You can see which one is more complex, but obviously it's more about the choice of what you make what is more appropriate because it can be interpreted in different ways if you would like. So all of these things we can include as part of our discussion of the visual. So overall, section C, you're going to have one article with at least one visual on the exam, and it might have comments or other comparative material as well. The whole text should only be about 2 pages long. A lot of the SACs and analyzing argument pieces that you do in school may be significantly longer than what you'll actually do on the exam. So think of it as a not too daunting task, but definitely be prepared. Um, a word count to aim for is at least 750 words to have enough discussion of body paragraphs and introduction and conclusion. And the criteria in green is what I read where I was talking about essentially what your task is. It is actually your criteria as well. And we can see it is literally the elements of what, how, and why. And generally, again, it's usually the quickest section to do because of how formulaic it is. Expanding our vocabulary. Remember how I said do not use shows, says, makes. Well, here you go. Here is an extensive list of all the kinds of words that you can use, and they're all appropriate for argument analysis, and many are also appropriate for your text response section. So take these words down, try to incorporate them, use them in your own vocabulary. You should never struggle to not use shows, says, or makes if you just have enough words in your vocabulary bank that are much better to substitute for. Some common issues and problems students have in the argument analysis section. So analysis just focusing on listing techniques. Empty analysis, that's just textbook phrases or definitions to describe the vague and very broad and general effects rather than injecting relevance and specificity by considering the material in light of the specific issue, argument, and audience. I have mentioned this idea already. Um, do not focus on analyzing in a general way. Every single time we have to relate it back to the specific article. Paraphrasing what the author is saying rather than actually saying what the author is doing. So in our analysis, taking ideas from the literal article to how it contributes to the argument rather than actually analyzing. So zooming in and really understanding how it contributes to the contention. But to avoid all of these, we just need to link back every piece of evidence to argument and contention. And if we use the what, how, why, we're pretty sorted. Otherwise, just remember, link back every single piece of evidence back to the argument and the contention. So beyond practice essays for section C, here are some things and techniques that you guys can do. So vocabulary. Expand your vocabulary. Make vocabulary banks of words to describe tone. For some students, this is not a particular issue. You have a range of ideas when it comes to tone. If that's not you and you use, really simple words like words for good or bad that are barely a step up, and not words like sarcastically, empathetically, condescendingly, derisively, and so on and so and similar kinds of words. You really need to go back and study some words to describe tone and accumulate a vocabulary bank. Words to describe the intended effect on readers. Again, for some students, not particular issue. Avoid saying intended effect, though you can say the author intends. Illicit feelings of, engenders, sense of something. There are lots of sentence frames and potential different verbs that you can use that will help you to describe intended effect. Words to avoid, like our fence sitting words. This successfully, this effectively. Remove those adjectives completely, but also avoid verbs that sound definitive as well. Verbs to describe what the author is doing. You've got such a good list here, guys. Use it, absolutely use it. Words to describe persuasive techniques and language devices. This is a very important one, and this is where most of you will have some issues and need to improve on. You really want to make sure you have a range of vocabulary under your belt. The reason you need to know all of your persuasive techniques is that so that you can make your analysis complex and score high marks in this section by picking things that a lot of students are going to miss, or the things that they're going to quote and not realize that it's a PLT and they're not going to use the meta language term for. So if you want to stand out against the rest of the state and practice for the lead up of your exam, want to score in the highest section, we need to be very across the board with PLTs. And still, it's like it's a big list, but in the end, like I would say, there's probably, maybe 25 common techniques you will see in most argument analysis, and then like another 25 maybe that are, less common but are great to use, a lot of them. So go and start studying, and you might have a list in your textbook if you have an English textbook, or you could go online or use some of the material for this from this lecture. Make a list of do's and don'ts. Use feedback from throughout the year with examples of what you did well and what you did not do well. So, what you would like to replicate and what you would like to improve. Review the list of criteria and the advice from the assessor's reports, as well as the exemplar, really good responses. Try to take things to put into your own writing and things that you need to fix. Rewrite some of the essays and some of the body paragraphs and analyses that you didn't do so well until you truly get better and get good at it. Don't just take feedback on board and leave it there. Either write another piece or one of the paragraphs you struggled with, or rewrite aspects of your assessments or just the essays that you got feedback on. And complete close analysis exercise. Choose a very short article or a comment and just write a body paragraph or two. If you struggle with introduction structure, write an introduction, write some practice introductions, then check if you've ticked off all the elements and it flows nicely and it has everything that needs to be there. Write conclusions and write comparative paragraphs if you struggle with the comparative paragraphs.